Hi, this is Muri reporting from Berlin, and this is part 6 of my using React hooks with D3 series. And in this one, I want to show you how to create chart components that can be responsive and that can adjust to the current viewport like this. And for that, I'm going to make use of something called the Resize Observer API, which is relatively new and hot. And for that, we're also going to write a custom React hook. So stay tuned. So in the last video, I was adding these tooltips to this bar chart to make it a bit more interactive. And as you can see, the bar chart so far is not responsive. The reason for that is we have been using the default dimensions of an SVG, which is 300 pixels wide and 150 pixels high. And yeah, we want to change that. We want to make it responsive. And also, so far we have been working in this single app.js file. We want to now extract this bar chart component into a component and make it reusable and make it responsive from there. So I already went ahead and extracted the bar chart component into a new file. It is nothing special. I thought I would just spare you the process. The only thing you should know is that the data is still defined in the app, and it is just passed to the bar chart component as this data prop. So we're still doing the same things here. We're still using the useEffect hook, the useRef hook. And yeah, that's basically it about the extraction. So now let's get into the more interesting part of making this bar chart here responsive. And for that, we need to prepare some things. We have to make sure that our SVG is no longer just 300 pixels. It is now going to be 100% wide like this. As you can see now, we will take the entire width, but our chart will not adjust, which is fine so far. And then I'm also going to add some padding here to the root element so that when our bar chart becomes responsive later, we can still kind of see the y-axis here on the right side. So that should be it for the CSS preparations. So now let's have a look at our bar chart component to see what we need to change to make it responsive and also a bit more reusable. And as you can see here, we have the X scale, and this is where we are mapping the index values of our data array to a range of 0 to 300, like here. And this doesn't work anymore because we cannot use this 300 value because we don't know that our SVG is going to be 300 pixels wide or not. So this value needs to change. It needs to become dynamic. And also with the Y scale, we cannot define the range like that. We also need to change this because we don't know the height of the SVG. And at this line, I'm going to add a to-do because this has nothing to do with the responsiveness itself. This has something to do with the data. Because earlier, in the earlier videos, I knew that the values in my data array are somewhere between 0 and 150, but in the context of this bar chart, we don't know that anymore. The data is defined from the outside, and we basically would need to analyze the min and max of the data values to define the domain array. So I will just leave it for now, but this is actually something we also need to change later. So in order to make these values dynamic and our bar chart responsive, we basically need to know how wide or how tall our SVG is at the moment in the browser. And we also need to know when these dimensions change because we also want to update our bar chart basically. So in order to do that, I'm going to use something called the Resize Observer API. And I'm also going to write it in a custom hook, which I'm going to define. So now I'm going to write a custom React hook, which will make use of the ResizeObserver API by observing a DOM element and returning the changed width and height of that element. So it is going to look like this. I'm going to say const use resize observer equals a function, and this function will receive a reference to an element, and it will return something which I want to now define as dimensions, like a width and a height. So these dimensions are actually going to be set by the Resize Observer, and in order to allow that, I have to make use of the use state hook, where I will be able to set these dimensions in the Resize Observer. So it will go like this: const dimensions and set dimensions equals use state null. So I will not have any initial dimensions, and this function is going to be used by the Resize Observer when the ref we are observing changes. So now for the Resize Observer. The Resize Observer needs a DOM element it can observe, and as you might remember from the very first lesson, we are using a useRef hook to define a reference, and this reference is passed to the SVG down here, and this reference gets updated and contains the SVG DOM element when all the DOM elements have been rendered inside the browser. And the best time to access this DOM element is in a useEffect hook, because useEffect is called for the very first time when the DOM elements have been rendered inside the browser. So we can access the DOM element inside this SVG reference. And this is basically what we also need to do with our use Resize Observer. We need to use a useEffect hook again to access the DOM element inside this reference when all the DOM elements have been rendered. So now I'm going to define my useEffect hook, where I want to access the DOM element inside that reference, and I need an empty dependency array for that for the beginning. And and here I'm going to define what I want to observe, the observed target, and it is going to be the ref.current, and the current property is where the DOM element lives inside that reference. And then I'm going to define my Resize Observer. The Resize Observer, like this, is going to be a new Resize Observer with a capital R. Capital R. And this is going to receive a callback, and this callback will receive the entries we are observing and the entries which are resizing as an argument. This is going to be an entries array, and we're just gonna log this entries array for later. And this is also the place where we have to update the dimensions we are storing here in this use state hook, so that we can make use of these dimensions in our bar chart component later. So I have to say set resized dimensions here. Yeah, we need to pass our reference here as a dependency to our useEffect. And also now we have defined our Resize Observer, but we have not told it what to observe. And for that we need to say Resize Observer, observe the observe target. And what we should also do here is return a cleanup function for this useEffect hook, which will be called whenever the component that uses this use Resize Observer hook is getting removed or unmounted. So for that we are going to say Resize Observer unobserve the observe target. So now we have our use Resize Observer that just logs out the entries which we are observing and which are resizing. And yeah, let's make use of that in our bar chart component to see what happens. So now I want to make use of this use Resize Observer, and for that I'm going to say const dimensions, because I know it returns dimensions, equals to use Resize Observer SVG ref. So if I now save this, you will see that this callback function I have defined here is being triggered because I am logging the entries array. And if I now analyze this entries array, you can see it has one entry. It targets my SVG, which is currently 354 pixels wide. And it has also this content rect object, which is supposed to describe my current element. But you can see here that the dimensions are kind of off. It says my SVG is 216 pixels wide, which is not true. So this seems to be odd when observing an SVG element. And what is also odd is if I resize my viewport here, it should actually trigger this callback function again, because that is the point of the Resize Observer. It should tell me basically whenever the element I'm observing resizes. And that doesn't work with the SVG element. So if you know better, or if you see what is wrong here, please let me know, because I have not found a way to make this work with SVG elements, but it actually works when I am working with a div element. So that's what we are going to do next. We're going to wrap our SVG element in a div element instead, and we're going to observe that element. So now I want to wrap my SVG in a div, and for that I'm going to go down here and cut out my SVG and paste it in a div like so. And if I save this, you will see that my layout actually has changed a bit. Our SVG is no longer going over the entire width of the viewport. And that is because I'm telling my SVG to be 100% wide, but I'm also using flexbox. And that doesn't go well if I'm wrapping my SVG in a div. And to fix that, I can just say align items stretch. So yeah, that will fix our layout issue here. So returning to the div element I've defined here, I now want to give it a different ref, which is going to be called the wrapper ref. And this is not yet defined, so I'm going to go up here and create a new reference, like so, wrapper ref. And now I'm going to use this reference in my use Resize Observer instead. So if I now save this, you will see that still my callback here triggers. I'm getting the entries array logged out. And if I analyze the entry, you can see now that I'm targeting a div element, which is 388-ish pixels wide. And if I now have a look at the content rect, it now aligns with the actual width of the element I'm observing. And in addition to that, if I now resize the viewport, you can see that my callback I have defined here is triggered every time. So this it didn't do when I was observing the SVG element, but it does work when I'm observing the div element instead. So let's see how the latest Resize Observer entry looks like. You can see my div is now like 342 pixels wide, and it still is reflected in the content rect object here. So there is one more little layout issue we should fix before continuing. You can see that the content rect is telling that my SVG, or my div element where I wrap my SVG into, is 182 pixels high, but my SVG is actually 150 pixels high, but it also has this margin, you can see here, the orange area on the bottom of the SVG. And that is also my own fault. I said that my SVG has a margin bottom of 2 rem, which are these 32 pixels. And I'm going to actually remove these and add them to my div instead, like so. Style, margin, bottom, and here I'm going to say 2 rem. So now if I have a look at the entry here, you can see it now fits the height of the SVG. So now finally we can make use of this content rect object here and save these resize dimensions in our useStateHook by using this setDimensions function to later on make them available in our bar chart here. So instead of logging these entries, I'm now going to say entries for each, because it is an array, and I want to call the setDimensions function here, set dimensions, and here I want to pass the entire content rect object to store them in our useStateHook. So now if I log these dimensions in my useEffectHook of my bar chart, like so, you will see that it is only logging null and only once, because I am not adding, or I didn't add my dimensions into my dependency array here. So this will make sure that when the dimensions change, our useEffectHook will be called again. So now you can see that initially our dimensions are null, and then we get the right dimensions. So what is happening is, when the bar chart is being rendered for the very first time, it tries to get these dimensions with this use Resize Observer hook. But the default value is null, and this useEffectHook, like I said in the very first lesson also, is not being called until the DOM elements have been rendered. So basically it is returning null for the very first time. And then these useEffectHooks kick in and they store these dimensions, causing our bar chart to re-render. And this is when we get our dimensions. Now basically what we need to do is make use of these dimensions in the places we need them. So now to make use of these dimensions, before I start, I will actually have to make sure that these dimensions exist, because as you can see here, the dimensions are null at the very beginning. So I have to basically say, if there are no dimensions, return, don't do anything. So now let's hunt these hard-coded values in our code here and replace them with these dimensions. And yeah, I already added this comment here. I am mapping these index values to a hard-coded range of 0 to 300 pixels. And now I can replace this 300 value with dimensions.width. And I can also replace these 150 pixels of my Y scale with dimensions.height. And then let's see what other hard-coded pixel values we have. We have this translate Y we are using to position the Y-axis here on the bottom. We can fix that by using backticks, like so, and then by saying not 150 pixels, but dimensions.height pixels. Then we have the same story here. We can just replace this part, say it is a translate X, and use dimensions width instead. Then let's see what other values do we have here. We are using a negative height to position the bars. You can see why we do that in a former video. I can say negative dimensions height, and here I'm also using a hard-coded value. And so if I now save this, yeah, you can see that we have a responsive chart right here. My browser is kind of dying because all of these console logs here, but yeah, you get the point. Now we have a responsive chart. So to recap, we have written a custom use Resize Observer hook that receives a reference to a DOM element. And it also uses the relatively new Resize Observer API to observe a DOM element, and then returns us the dimensions of that observed DOM element, also when it resizes. So then our bar chart goes ahead and gets these dimensions by calling the use Resize Observer with the reference to a div element and not the SVG element, because there is some oddities going on when observing an SVG element. So, and these dimensions we're then using to basically render our bar chart here with D3. So, like I said, the Resize Observer API is relatively new, and for that the browser support is relatively thin at the moment. It is not supported in Edge or Safari, for example, but you can use a polyfill like this one to make it available in Safari and Edge also. I strongly encourage you to do that by just installing it via npm and adding it to the top of the file like so. And then the Resize Observer, which is being used here, will make use or will use this polyfilled version instead. And also, why you should use the Resize Observer is it is actually the most efficient way to know if an element has resized, because earlier you had to attach a resize event listener to the window and then basically calculate the new width or height of an observed element from there. And when the window is resizing, you cannot know for sure if the element you're observing is resizing as well. So you had to do a lot of overhead to get these updated values. So I strongly recommend using the Resize Observer and using this polyfill if you want to use it across many browsers. And just to test this polyfill, I went ahead and installed it here via npm. And you can see here I'm running the app in Safari, and there's a reference error because it doesn't know what a Resize Observer is. But now if I comment in the Resize Observer from the polyfill, you can see it's working, and it's also like working properly. So I hope you liked this video and learned a thing or two about the Resize Observer. I for sure did. And also I hope you learned something about writing a custom hook. And yeah, let me know what you think about this video here. Yeah, see you next time, I guess. Bye!